Ladies and gentlemen, denizens of my digital empire, I am your host, your imperator, your first citizen, TsarOctavian, and welcome back to the history of professional wrestling. Today is the last of the 1950s, and we gotta start off on a rather rough note that I can no longer unfortunately avoid. So, let's get started. During my mini retrospective on the first part of Mae Young's career, I neglected to mention someone who was very important to her career. And there's a reason for that. The person I did not mention is one of the worst human beings to enter the annals of pro wrestling's history, allegedly. With a career spanning 55 years, 10 of which were spent as the NWA World Women's Champion, wrestler, trainer, manager, pimp. This is the infamous, fabulous Moolah. After losing her mother to cancer, Moolah's father would take the young Mary Ellison to her first pro wrestling show in an attempt to cheer her up. During the show, she would watch the great Mildred Burke perform, and Ellison had discovered what she wanted to do with her life. Later on, she would also be inspired by the great Lou Thesz as well. When she became of age, Ellison would seek out training underneath Billy Wolfe and Mildred Burke. During her training, she would meet and form a lifelong friendship with Mae Young. Of course, in typical Wolfe fashion, he would begin making advances towards Ellison. Moolah refused said advances, left Wolfe's camp, and formed a relationship with another wrestler named Johnny Long. Long would recommend her to his friend and promoter, Jack Pfeffer. Pfeffer was the one who paired her with the nature boy Buddy Rogers, and would give her the moniker Slave Girl Moolah. They were a very successful pairing until Rogers would make sexual advances towards Moolah. After her split from Rogers, Moolah would start working for Tootsmont and Vince McMahon Sr. in New York, winning a battle royal for the vacant NWA Women's World Championship. This may have been the start of the turbulent relationship between the NWA and McMahon. And if y'all remember back to the second episode of the history of professional wrestling, you'll remember who in the NWA was basically running all of women's wrestling. Perpetual Horn Dog, Billy Wolfe. Upon hearing that one of his ungrateful students who rejected him and ran off with another man was now his women's world champion without his blessing, Wolfe demanded that the NWA not recognize the title win. If it wasn't for, allegedly, that Wolfe was pimping out his girls to other promoters in the NWA, I wouldn't be able to understand why the NWA repeatedly put up with Wolfe's, well, bullshit. Eventually, the NWA would appease Wolfe, but they didn't have a replacement for Moolah, and Vince McMahon Sr. refused to cave to Billy Wolfe's demands. And so, despite his best efforts, Slave Girl Moolah would be Capital Wrestling's Women's World Champion for a staggering 28 years, though the NWA only recognizes 10 of those years. Moolah, to this day, remains the longest reigning Women's World Champion in NWA's history, and even surpassed Mildred Burke's 20-year title reign if you go by the now WWE's claim, which also makes her the longest reigning world champion in WWE's history. Now, we will talk more about Moolah later on, unfortunately. For now, let's talk about why she's infamous in the wrestling business. You may have heard about her leaving Billy Wolf and Buddy Rogers over sexual advances, and you may assume that she was completely disgusted by these moments. And maybe she went on to fight for other women to be treated fairly in the wrestling business, and not just as sexual objects. You would be so fucking wrong. Moolah would open up her own school and would buy her own apartment complex near the school. She would have young women's wrestlers stay at her apartments, demand rent for the young women to pay for utilities, for training, would take 25% of their earnings, 50% if they went to go work for Vince McMahon Sr. Moolah would take a page out of Billy Wolf's book and would frequently pimp out her women's wrestlers to promoters. She would also encourage drug abuse with her students in order to get these young ladies addicted and dependent on Moolah. Often, many of these girls were deep in debt to Moolah, so they pretty much would wrestle for free. I'd highly recommend the Dark Side of the Ring episode on Moolah for more information in regards to the allegations against Moolah. For now, we are going to turn the page on the fabulous Moolah to start talking about wrestling I'd actually be in a good mood to talk about. In the late 1940s, former pro wrestlers Nick Goulas, Herb Welch, and with a young lady whose family would become very important to Memphis Pro Wrestling's history, Christine Jarrett, who was working in ticket sales. All three would found NWA Mid-America Wrestling. On that note, my buddy Edmund, who's very important to the show, was surprised when I told him that the challenger in the main event made almost as much money as the world champion. This is the perfect spot to pull back the curtain a bit and explain the importance of the ticket booth employees, more precisely as the backstage terminology would coin it, the gate. Besides selling tickets, the most important job one would have in the ticket booth was asking customers questions, mainly getting as much information as you can to relay to the promoter. What match would you like to see on the card? Who did you come to see? Who would you like to see more of? So on and so forth. So, as an example, Mrs. Jarrett could report to Goulas that Thez sold 4,500 tickets. Luther Lindsay sold 4,000 tickets, out of a total of 10,000 tickets sold, which tells Goulas to try to bring back Thez as often as the NWA would allow, as well as book him against Lindsay to really maximize profits. And then, of course, on top of merch sales, Goulas could look at who's selling some tickets, but not quite main event level yet, and who's not. Blah, blah, blah. And finally, the wrestlers got paid off of total ticket sales and merch. With the world champ getting a bonus for bringing in more tickets, it was actually custom back in the day for local wrestlers to thank the world champ for the boosted ticket sales by shaking his hand in the locker room and saying, "Hey champ, thank you for the house." I would also like to briefly pause here and state the following. The topic which was gonna be discussed in this chapter swung wildly to different topics, like 6 different times, before finally settling on this scatterbrained hodgepodge of just southern stew, if you will. All that being said, what do you do when a heated feud needs just that extra dash of spice? Something to really kick it up to the next level. When two men, the on-screen characters, who absolutely hate each other and no longer do headlocks and arm bars make sense for the story being told, well, you've got to kick it to the extreme. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing Wild Bull Curry, the father of hardcore wrestling. Curry joined the circus at just 16 years old and had quite the fearsome reputation as a tough man, with 65 legitimate wins and not one making it past the first round. It wouldn't be long before pro wrestling came calling for Bull. In the 1940s, Bull Curry would debut in Detroit, Michigan, and very quickly established his wild man personas. His matches were not pretty, they were gritty and incredibly violent, especially for the era. The buzz he generated in Detroit led him into becoming one of the NWA's top heels in the 1950s. In particular, Bull was massive in the state of Texas. Despite his size and incredible popularity, his unpredictable wildman character may have been to his detriment, as the majority of NWA promoters didn't want him as champion, and there were quite a few wrestlers that didn't quite want to work that style. The NWA, nevertheless, would award Bull the NWA Texas Brass Knuckles Championship, a belt he would hold 20 different times in his career, and the NWA Texas Heavyweight Championship. During his reign of terror in the state of Texas, Bull would constantly inspire riots, often having to fight off fans who wanted to save their beloved babyfaces from the non-stop onslaught violence that was occurring to them, and even started bringing weapons to the ring, such as chairs and even a fucking cinder block once. Which is insane because bringing the chair in is already pretty new for the time period, I believe. This dude just comes in with a... Also, I would like to note his grandson has a TikTok page that goes into the family history, and I will be discussing Wild Bull Curry's son in a much later installment around the 80s, I believe. But go ahead and check out his grandson's TikTok. He might be doing other stuff on social media. If it's there, go ahead and check it out. I might put the links down in the description. Hopefully I remember. We move on from the true innovator of extreme violence to a barrier-breaking heel and one of the biggest stars in the 1950s. Pro wrestler, lawbreaker, civil rights activist, 229 pounds of twisted steel and sex appeal, Roscoe Monroe Brombaugh, a.k.a. Sputnik Monroe. Debuting in the sport of professional wrestling in 1945, traveling through various circuses as Rock Monroe, he would eventually change his name to capitalize on the Cold War space race, becoming Sputnik Monroe. Sputnik was such a master bad guy that on one occasion it's noted that while holding an armbar and threatening to break the beloved local babyface's arm, a sheriff threatened to shoot Monroe if he did. Monroe thought he was bluffing and really kind of hoped that he knew that it was kind of an act, but unfortunately, when the sheriff began counting to 3, he had to actually release the hold. In 1957, worn out from a long drive, Sputnik would meet a black hitchhiker at a gas station. The two would hit it off, and Sputnik would ask the hitchhiker to drive him to the arena. Upon arriving, Sputnik would wrap his arm around his newfound friend, receiving a deafening wail of boos, and a light bulb would go off in Monroe's head. Smack dab in the middle of Jim Crow law Memphis, Tennessee, Sputnik Monroe had found what was going to make him an absolute monster of a heel. From then on, Sputnik would rail against racist wrestling fans and racism across the country. He began to attend black-only bars, socializing with the patrons and handing out tickets to the shows. The police would arrest Monroe on whatever charges they could drum up, and to really drive his point home, Monroe would go so far as to seek out and hire black attorneys for his court cases. Monroe achieved a rather odd feat in a sense. To his white audience, he was the biggest heel in all of the South. To his rapidly growing black audience, he was their hero, an incredibly beloved babyface, becoming such a massive draw that he was able to demand the end of segregation of the audiences in places like Ellis Auditorium, and was successful in getting his demands met. Monroe, along with the NWA, also refusing to send their top promoters out to several stadiums in the South, were able to successfully desegregate most stadiums for both fans and performers. I would like to note this does not mean segregation was completely over in the sport of professional wrestling, but the long fight for equality, which started almost 50 years prior, was slowly but surely coming to an end. So with all the warm fuzzies in our tummies from that last section, who wants to learn about a good old case of arson? The Dallas Sportatorium. What Madison Square Garden is to New York is exactly what the Sportatorium was to Texas, and it was a piece of shit. Many wrestlers who performed there during its heyday of the 1980s referred to it as a complete dump. I'm sure if I could call my uncle up now, he'd tell y'all it was a dump. A prestigious dump. Opened up in 1934, mainly as a music and dance hall, most notably hiring young up-and-coming talent to perform such as Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, Hank Snow, and Johnny Carroll, before opening its doors to pro wrestling shows. Ed McLemore was the promoter and owner of the Sportatorium in 1953. He had previously worked under the NWA banner before leaving to run his own promotion. There was a problem. In 1952, the city of Dallas had actually condemned the Sportatorium. Not because it was a piece of shit, but because several meters of the stadium were actually built on land not owned by McLemore. Now, if you are McLemore, and you have a bone to pick with your previous business partners, and you'd be stuck having to foot the bill for demolishing and then rebuilding your stadium, it may pay to, well, provoke a response. Allegedly, McLemore began advertising his true world champion and stated that the NWA had a false and aging world champ because the NWA champ would not wrestle his top star. I'd like to take this aside. My dear viewer, the aging world champion in the NWA at the time was Lou Thesz, who would continue to be a top draw in the United States until the 1970s, 17 years later, and all over the world until his retirement in 1993, 40 years later. So if anyone thought he was aging and needed to move over for the younger talent back in 1953, they'd be waiting a really long time for that. Anyways, the NWA did not bite, however. So, desperate times called for desperate measures, such as claiming that the NWA itself was illegitimate and acted as a mafia syndicate. And the true ace up his sleeve was putting out a program for a big show that he had coming up, where he would reveal all of pro wrestling secrets. And you may hear from online fans that there were newspaper articles published in the 1890s and again in the 1910s exposing pro wrestling as fake. So everyone knew and just pretended that they didn't. But I want to ask you, my audience, how many wrestling fans in Dallas, Texas, do you believe had bought and read New York dirt rag magazines, newspapers, what have you, from the 1890s and 1910s? If you said none, your answer is the exact same as mine. My rant aside, this was the final straw for the NWA. 3 days before this show and all the secrets were to be exposed live, arsonists lit the Sportatorium on fire. The original Sportatorium was mostly made from wood, so you just know that fucker lit up like a birthday candle. If it was all planned, then McLemore was a genius. He proved that, yes, his opposition did operate like the mafia. The Sportatorium got demolished for free, and the insurance he had on it covered 1/3 of the rebuilding cost. It was now going to be off-state land, which allowed McLemore to proudly advertise upon its reopening that it was now the new $1 million Sportatorium, today's equivalent of $12 million. So I'd say everything worked out for McLemore. After reopening, shockingly, McLemore would actually rejoin the NWA. And while being one of the most successful promoters in the United States, he would take under his wing a fellow Texan, a younger man who had just started his wrestling career after playing football in Canada and being trained by Stu Hart. This new student was Jack Adkisson, or as the world knows him now as Fritz von Erich. We will be returning to Fritz in a much later entry in this series. We have covered several firsts in pro wrestling, but one of the firsts we haven't covered yet is arguably one of the most popular genres in pro wrestling. And before we leave the 1950s, it's time to discuss minis in professional wrestling. I would like to issue a polite warning. If you're not a fan of the word midget, I would suggest skipping this chapter. Some find the word offensive, some don't. But I will have to use this word repeatedly through the section, so you have been warned. Starting in American vaudeville shows before becoming a featured attraction throughout Canadian promotions, eventually, midget wrestling would catch the eye of the NWA. The crown jewel was Canadian-born Sky Low Low, one of the most iconic little people in professional wrestling history. He would win a mini battle royal and became the very first NWA World Midget Champion, mostly feuding with fellow little person wrestler Farmer Brooks. Now, unfortunately, just like with their tag team titles, the NWA of the 1950s did not take their little person division seriously. So, until 1983, records on who won, who lost was incredibly shaky, if not completely non-existent for the history of the NWA World Midget Championship. Nonetheless, the next recorded champion we have on record is also one of the most iconic little people in professional wrestling. Arguably the Lou Thez of mini wrestling, Little Beaver. Beaver, as well as Sky Low Low, were incredibly big draws for their genre and in pro wrestling in general. What Little Beaver specialized in was comedy. After all, doing comedy spots often meant taking a lot less bumps. As an aside, a modern pro wrestling ring is a lot nicer to be thrown down onto. And a recent study showed that even currently, with all of our advancements, the trauma that pro wrestlers cause to their bodies on a nightly basis is the equivalent of surviving multiple car accidents. So you can imagine back in the 40s and 50s with pro wrestling rings just being really stiff-ass boxing rings, taking any kind of fall for a little person would have been absolutely brutal. Which is why Little Beaver probably did turn to comedy to extend his career and as long as possible, reducing the amount of impact and injury, making as much money as he possibly could. To this day, Little Beaver's comedy spots are still a staple in mini professional wrestling, which is insane to think about. Another key figure in the early days of mini pro wrestling was Lord Littlebrook. Born into a working class family in England, he would start working in the United States, first in the circus before transitioning into professional wrestling. 8 years after Gorgeous George, Littlebrook would also adopt a pompous, arrogant, European aristocrat. Lord Littlebrook somewhat went in the opposite direction of Little Beaver, engaging in high-impact matches, being one of the earliest high flyers in professional wrestling. And what's truly incredible, and what makes Lord Littlebrook just built different for his time, was despite his high-flying style, the incredibly stiff rings, he went on to have a shockingly long career. While not taken seriously in the United States, though with the exception of particular territories and aforementioned Canada becoming a hotspot for mini wrestling, where mini wrestling really took off was in Mexico. Mexican wrestling fans absolutely adored watching little people dressed in lucha gear performing high-flying spots, the usual comedy bits, all the while dressed like little lucha libre superheroes. To this day, all throughout lucha libre promotions, mini wrestling is a practical requirement. And if I ever get to Mexico, I will go into a lot more detail about minis in Mexico. Born in Italy, immigrated to Argentina before moving to the United States to train under the great former world champion Stanislaus Zbyszko. This man was one of the biggest icons in professional wrestling, becoming one of the earliest pioneers of a high-flying style. His popularity transcended the wrestling ring, becoming the only wrestler to defeat Superman in Superman's own comic books. The man I'm speaking of is none other than Argentina Antonio Rocca. Having already developed his acrobatic style before making his debut in 1948 in Galveston, Texas, audiences were gobsmacked. Luthez was a premier athlete without a doubt, but even the great Thez's athleticism was eclipsed by a young Rocca. It did not take long for Antonio to be crowned Texas heavyweight champion. I should mention here, he was one of the earliest, if not maybe the first, to wrestle completely barefoot, which added a kind of working class detail in a way to his character. Some promoters explained it as he was too poor to afford boots, which I guess audiences just shrugged and said, yeah, sure. But if you really think about it though, what does it say about the promoter who pays his wrestlers so little they can't even afford boots? Regardless, while touring the United States, Rocca would generate enough buzz to get booked by Toots Mondt in pro wrestling's most sacred arena, Madison Square Garden. Unfortunately, the show itself bombed, only selling 5,000 tickets. The blame did not fall squarely on Rocca's shoulders. However, Mondt encouraged Rocca to continue touring and really make a name for himself across the United States. With the advent of this little piece of technology known as the television, however, Rocca began really generating a buzz across the United States for several years to come, to the point that he had caught the eye of the National Wrestling Alliance, who booked him for a pair of shows, both against their world champion, Luthez. Once again, though both shows would undersell, and to the NWA, it would seem that the high-flying I would like to say to my crowd right now, there's a little breaking the fourth wall. In the script, I have misspelled flying, and it now says the high-slaying Argentinian. So, make of that what you will. Once again, though both shows would undersell, and to the NWA, it would seem that the high-flying Argentinian just wasn't the draw that all this hype had built him up for them to believe. Rocca would step away from the ring for a few months to sort out his visa issues, as well as butting heads with Fred Collier and Toots Mondt over pay. Both had offered Rocca a deal of $80,000 a year. However, their takeaways from it left Rocca with only $25,000. Enter Vince McMahon Sr. Sr. saw the value in Antonio Rocca. Sr. saw an attraction and a superstar where many others just saw a man who could cartwheel and dropkick really well. Sr. was also a genius promoter who had an idea to keep Rocca as an attraction by utilizing him in an often underappreciated and underutilized form of professional wrestling, putting Rocca in his brand new tag division. McMahon would pair him with Puerto Rican Miguel Perez, crowning them with the NWA Tag Team Championships. To backpedal a bit, why did seemingly Rocca work better in a tag team than as a single? The answer is in the tag match formula. A very important key moment in almost every tag match is the hot tag, a moment that the match is set up and usually based on the bad guys beating down one tag partner, taunting the other, until finally the tag partner can break away from these dastardly heels, run towards his ally who should be on the apron of the ring, building up suspense and hype, making the tag. As the audience erupts, the incoming tag partner fires up on the bad guys with exciting and flashy maneuvers. Who better to really reward an anxious crowd than the high-flying Rocca, reducing his bumps while also spotlighting him and almost making him the focal point of the match. Perez and Rocca became easily the most exciting part of McMahon's TV show, feuding with the likes of the Graham brothers, the Fabulous Kangaroos, and Wild Bill Curry, with a tag partner I'm gonna reserve to mention for a later episode. McMahon Sr. would boast proudly that Rocca's matches were so in demand that he was featured on 5 different TV channels simultaneously. It's one thing to make people desperately want to change the channel to see you, it's another to make people go out of their way to run to the store and buy a TV just to watch your matches. And that is exactly what Rocca did for many people in the Northeast. Under McMahon, Rocca had become a massive superstar in every sense of the word. He was constantly interviewed by magazines and newspapers, appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, something I can't really find online, but I'm assured it happened, and would later even meet with the president, Tricky Dick Richard Nixon, while staying humble enough to visit sick kids in hospitals and even going out of his way to attend weddings when even fans would invite him. Despite 5 consecutive sellouts, main eventing against the amazing Zuma, drawing a record crowd that wouldn't be broken in Madison Square Garden for another decade, Vince McMahon wanted to keep Rocca more of an attraction and a tag team guy, more than a featured singles player. There's something noted in this article and several others that I was reading for this research. There was the issues between the Puerto Rican fans and the Italian New York fans. Puerto Rican New Yorkers and Italian New Yorkers, and this is going to be an issue until like the 1980s, that dissuaded Vince McMahon from using Rocca as his world champion. Regardless, Rocca would leave the WWF and would found his own promotion in Queens, New York, before eventually coming back to Vince as a commentator. He would leave once more, working in Japan and Puerto Rico as a big name in the 1970s, before unfortunately passing away in 1977 from a urinary tract infection. Another thing of note, before closing everything out, Lou Thesz in an interview had stated that he and Rocca had sold out Madison Square Garden on 2 separate occasions, with some sources backing up Thesz's claims. I believe those matches were different from the ones that were stated to have underwhelmed at the box office. Though this is kind of tricky information why these episodes take a while to come out. It's not until really the 80s, probably the 70s, where we get consistent reporting and news and all that. Thesz also complimented Rocca as an athlete, though didn't believe that he was a great wrestler. So, that's Lou Thesz is consistent in his thought process and who he thinks is great and who he thinks is not so good. Antonio Rocca will go down as one of pro wrestling's biggest superstars, who never truly fulfilled his potential for one reason or another. But what he accomplished in his time in pro wrestling is truly incredible. I would argue now that he was the last superstar of pro wrestling's golden age, as far as 1940s through the 1950s. Though we do have big stars to talk about in the 1960s. This makes Rocca the very last in my series of massive superstars from the golden era that I needed to talk about. At least I feel, as far as the 40s and 50s go. Rocca was truly one and only, an innovator like no other, who left us way, way too soon. The smartest thing McMahon did before Rocca left was to pair Rocca up with another Italian man that Tootsmont was head over heels for. Having Rocca help this young man get properly introduced to the New York crowd, that young man would in due time take not just New York, but Capitol Wrestling, soon to be the WWF, by storm. Next time on the history of professional wrestling, the Italian strongman, Bruno Sammartino, Gloria Rome. Woo! Hey man, that was only 8 minutes long. At least it's not the 22-minute behemoth that was Chapter 2.